falling between meanings, I think in a lot of spaces, we try to target demographics or something. Like we think labels are meaningful. I want to be careful with that because I think labels are useful, right? They're words. We use words to convey things. We use words to express something. This is what I love about CSS. CSS is really expressive in a way that other languages feel less so to me. But we're conveying meaning. We're conveying some meaning, but it's a little loose. There's sort of words will have multiple meanings, and meanings won't. There are meanings that don't attach directly to words, and we have to come up with new words or new combinations of words or give a word a new meaning. Language is messy, and people are messy, and we can try to categorize ourselves. We can try to put structure on it, try to put form on it, but those are just narratives that we build around the chaos that's there. And narratives are useful, but they aren't the thing, and we will keep falling in between things. We'll always come up short when we're trying to structure the world. And I think that's particularly relevant to me working in tech, where it seems to me like a lot of the project of tech as an industry is trying to make everyone fit the box, the algorithm. There's a strong, like, you can have a single identity and it can be defined, and Facebook can understand your single identity and then sell that single identity to advertisers. And it is that simple. Your existence is that simple. You can't be captured in a database.
My name is Skulk Netlin, and this is the Mechanical Ink Podcast, a podcast about open source, the open web, sustainability, and those who want to make the web and the world a better place. Hey Miriam, and welcome to the Mechanical Ink Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a big pleasure. I'm a little bit starstruck, but it's okay. I've been following your work for a long time, and I appreciate everything you do for the web. So, and we'll dig into a bunch of those things that you do. But yeah, so it's quite a thing to be speaking to you on this podcast.
That's very nice. Yeah.
So I think a lot of people will know you are who listens to this, but there's always, like they say, every day somebody's born that hasn't seen Gremlins. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand the mic over to you and just have you introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Miriam Suzanne. I do a lot of different things. I suppose I'm here because of the things I do online. Where these days I'm an invited expert on the CSS working group. That's a lot of what I've been doing lately, helping develop new features like container queries and cascade layers in scope, which has been a lot of fun. I'm also one of the founders of Oddbird. So we've been doing web development for companies since 2008. It's been a while. And it was just me and my brothers. We were both freelancing. Me and my older brother were freelancing, and we were like, we should just do this together and put a name on it. So we did, and then my younger brother was like, I'll do that too. And we've been going for a long time now, and have a really great team there, a small team who cares about the web and enjoys building custom web interfaces, whatever they are, for whoever needs. Yeah, so we've been doing it for a while, and it's been fun to get to contribute to the languages and the tools, as well as building the actual projects, the websites.
So if you if you say Artbird cares about the web, what does that mean from your perspective?
Yeah. Well, right from the start, I mean, we started our first sort of projects that we put out there were open source projects. I think all of us were really into what the web can do in terms of sharing, in terms of collaboration. Um, there's an openness. There's a political vision behind the web, and that's not to say that everybody on the web has the same political vision, or that every project on the web does. But the web comes out of this idea of sharing information freely. It was public domain as soon as it was launched. Um, the whole goal was sharing scientific papers freely, and there's sort of a vision there that's continued, and I think it's a vision that's important to us, um, despite some of the ways it can be twisted.
Yeah. I listened to this talk of Jack Conte, the founder of Patreon, this year, I think it was this year at South by Southwest. And it was super interesting because he kind of talked about like where the web started in the 2000s, Web 1.0. I don't think it was ever
Mm-hmm.
officially called that, but whatever. And then he
Uh-huh.
kind of moved into Web 2.0. And then it was this whole idea, like that's when YouTube and all these things popped up. And this whole
Mm-hmm.
idea that we weren't just like passive consumers of the web, we could like contribute to it in interesting different ways, a tweet or a YouTube video or whatever. But he was also talking about this idea of you being able to reach people, because he was talking about like when he was still just making music, and he would play to bars and there'd be like nobody there, it's just like him playing, and then he like a friend of his or something said, hey, did you see this guitarist guy on YouTube, and like he's just singing to a webcam and he's got like 300,000 views, and it like blew his mind, and he started making YouTube videos, and that's how Pomplamoose eventually got going and all that kind of stuff. But then Eli goes on and he talks about the rise of social media, Facebook, all these kinds of things, and how people started making content to satisfy the whims of the algorithm. So you weren't making
Right.
content and art because of what you wanted to do as an artist. You're kind of making content to satisfy the algorithm because that's how you can get the reach. And he also talked about the thing from Kevin Kelly, who talked about the 1,000 true fans. And if you have that, and I think it's something like 1,000 true fans buying $100 worth of stuff a year, that gives you $100,000 a year of income, and that's a decent living. That's a good business. Um, I don't know. That was just incredible to me, because he's like this whole idea about the subscribe button on YouTube and the follower idea, and like how social media and how like talking to that where you said how things can be twisted, um how he wants the web to go back to that thing where it was a way to reach people, not just people making stuff to satisfy an algorithm kind of thing, like. And I
Right.
think that speaks to so much that you've said about like the intent of the web when it was originally founded, right?
Yeah, and I think there's some interesting things in that narrative too. I mean, if you look at the first browser, the www hypermedia browser and editor, it was an editor. So it's a little strange to me to talk about Web 1.0 as not interactive when the first browser includes a page builder as part of the browser, right? It was always intended to be something that we all contribute to and interact with. And so, at some point, the technology became able to do that easier. And then also at that point, we got walled gardens for doing that, where now, like you say, the algorithm is the audience. I mean, there's always been in art, like who is my audience? Who am I playing to? We can't claim that artists have always been sort of free of uh, you know any audience that they have to play to. Um, maybe what's interesting now is that audience isn't the actual people that are viewing the work or listening to our songs. It is an algorithm, and it's a company that runs that algorithm and makes those choices and decides what should be rewarded. And that's often what keeps you on the app rather than any other criteria.
Yeah, I think what he was also talking to is this idea that on social media, when you have followers, it's a very loose term, because when you post, like maybe now with Mastodon, things have changed a bit, but in general, like your big social media that most people know, when you post there, it's not chronological. Like you can post something and like almost none of the people that follow you see your actual work, right? You're not
Right.
sharing what you're making directly with your audience.
Yeah.
It's still up to the algorithm to decide whether it deems your content that you've posted worthy of being shown to the people who are following you, which is very strange, but it's a reality. And I think if you go to your website today, like miriamsuzanne.com, there's this quote at the top that, I don't know, maybe I'm stretching here, but it feels like this talks to all of this a little bit. And the quote is, "People are queer. We fall between the meanings and explore outside them. We grasp its stability and form, but always come up short." Do you want to unpack that a little bit? And am I stretching if I'm trying to make a parallel there?
Maybe not. It's hard for me to say. At one point I had to write an artist statement for something. I was submitting some poetry to an anthology, and they wanted a statement. And I thought, well, what is my statement? And that was a chunk of it. And that's sort of the chunk that survived since 2012 or something. It used to be longer, and every year or so I narrow it down to like what is important to me.
Yeah.
What is the statement for why I'm here, why I'm doing, and I sort of think of my web work as part of this, my art. I don't know. When I try to separate them, I get lost. So to me, it's all about connecting with an audience, telling stories, building experiences, having these interactions. So yeah, falling between meanings. I think in a lot of spaces, we try to target demographics or something. Like we think labels are meaningful, and I want to be careful with that, because I think labels are useful, right? They're words. We use words to convey things. We use words to express something. This is what I love about CSS. CSS is really expressive in a way that other languages feel less so to me. But we're conveying meaning. We're conveying some meaning, but it's a little loose. There's sort of, words will have multiple meanings, and meanings won't. There are meanings that don't attach directly to words, and we have to come up with new words or new combinations of words or give a word a new meaning. Language is messy.
Yeah.
And people are messy. And we can try to categorize ourselves. We can try to put structure on it, try to put form on it. But those are just narratives that we build around the chaos that's there. And narratives are useful, but they aren't the thing. And we will keep falling in between things. We'll always come up short when we're trying to structure the world. And I think that's particularly relevant to me working in tech, where it seems to me like a lot of the project of tech as an industry is trying to make everyone fit the box, the algorithm. There's a strong, like, you can have a single identity, and it can be defined, and Facebook can understand your single identity and then sell that single identity to advertisers. And it is that simple. Your existence is that simple. And I sort of fundamentally believe the opposite.
Yeah.
You can't be captured in a database.
No. no, I'm with you there. There is this website that when it just started, I was a little confused as to what it was trying to be. And then I saw a video of the founder and he explained what he meant by the name. And then I was like, oh my goodness, that's me. They've lost their way and I'm not sure where they're going. The site's called Polywork. Um,
Oh yeah.
I'm not sure where they're going. It sounded so interesting and exciting. And then they kind of, I don't know what happened there. But what he said is the reason they use the term polywork is because people today aren't identified by their job. Like in the past, it used to be like, what do you do for a living? And it will be like, well, I am the senior blah at this thing, and I'll be there until I'm 65 and then I'll leave. That's me. It's my identity. Nowadays, our jobs is not our identity because oftentimes we do a million things. Like you just said, like you do a bunch of stuff. And I mean, I do a whole bunch of stuff as well. And that's just how people are generally. We're curious individuals, right? So I really I really liked that. And I was hoping the site would play to that and it would be something where polyworkers can like collaborate. But then it kind of went into some weird direction. And now it's like a website builder or something. I'm not sure what it ended up being, which is really sad. But yeah, but I think that's I love that quote that you have there. Um, thanks for unpacking that. I really enjoyed that.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
And so you talked about CSS. Now you love CSS and all of that. But then so now I have a thing that I want you to talk about, and I had it as two separate things, but I think it maybe makes more sense to just compress it into one thing. So there's this video that was called "Why is CSS so weird?" And there's more to it than just the video, but then at the same time, like I watched that and I listened to all of these things, and I love CSS. Like I love the web, so I love the core languages a lot. But I don't know when it started. Maybe so. Some people will say it started when the big JavaScript frameworks, became super popular. Is when this kind of idea started. Maybe that's true. I don't know, but more and more I run into people who vehemently would do almost anything to not have to write HTML and CSS. And like, I don't understand. I can to some extent understand as the author or as just a casual writer who want to write a blog post that HTML can be a bit of a pain and you'd want to use Markdown. Cool, I get that. But if you're building websites and stuff like that, why are people so opposed to that? And why especially like HTML, people have kind of just like, that's not even a programming language, that's just something. And then CSS, people are just like, I don't understand it. I don't want to understand it. I just want something to just spit out something like Bootstrap, Tailwind, all these things. So that's like I threw a bunch of stuff at you now, so feel free to start wherever it makes most sense. But like, why do you think it is that people? Is it because CSS is just so weird, or is there something deeper here that we're missing?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about deeper. I think you're right. I came out of print design though, right? And I feel like a fear of design is older than JavaScript frameworks. And then when we talk about programming, a lot of the way that we talk about programming is that it's mathematical and logical, and those are things that do not describe design. As much as there are reasonable rules for what works and what doesn't work in design, it's not logical and consistent, and the same color looks different in different contexts. Everything is contextual. So if you start taking these programming ideas like functional programming, we're supposed to have no side effects that impact the context, right? You try applying that to design and it just falls apart right away. So I see a lot of programming as pushing towards this. There is one answer. It's a mathematical answer. It's a word means one thing. It does one thing. A tool does one thing. It does it well. And you sort of can't put those concepts onto design well. And so it makes sense to me that you funnel people into an industry to avoid all that, and towards this vision of everything can be defined in a database. And yeah, they're not going to like the language that doesn't do that. And I don't see that as a problem with the language. I see that as it's not, it doesn't do the thing that you think languages should do. That's fine. I love it. I want to write poetry that the computer understands. I think that's interesting about CSS. And CSS does have some, the designers of CSS went out of their way to make it even more that way, to make it even more contextual and even more sort of linguistic. Because the cascade comes out of this idea that, I think John Alsop said it really well in the 2000 article, The Tao of Web Design. It's a limitation of the printed page that you can't change it. So once it's done, it's done. You control everything about it, and that's a limitation. And that's a hard thing to learn on the web, is that it was designed so that we don't control it. It was designed so that we have this feature where the browser can change things based on the device interface or what features the browser supports, forwards and backwards and sideways compatibility. But also, the users can change things. You can bump up your font size, bump down your font size, choose your favorite font. You have control over the final design that you see. And that means that we don't have control over the final design that you see. And the whole language is built around that. That's what the cascade is. Cascade is style sheets coming from authors, browsers, and users and getting pulled together and somehow creating design out of that, which is almost an absurd proposition, right? We're going to design on an infinite and unknowable canvas collaboratively with people we've never met. And somehow it's going to work. And somehow it does work. But that's pretty wild. And that means that we need a language that works differently from something where I would just tell the computer what to do in a known context, and it just does it in that context. We're not in that situation for CSS. It's a harder, more complicated, weirder problem to solve. Trying to solve design anywhere for anyone. That's wild.
It is.
I would be scared of it. I get people being scared of it for not wanting to do that.
Yeah, but I think maybe it is the unwillingness to let go of the control, right? It's this whole idea that maybe it's a little bit of being too precious about the thing you made. I think we're all guilty of that. Well, I know I am anyway. Where you make a thing and you think it's just so perfect. That's stretching because nothing will ever be. But that the idea that somebody else could remove or add something to that is just scary. It's like, no, but I've spent so much time to ensure this button is just this way and reacts just this way when you do this, that, and the other thing. I don't want anybody else to be able to change that. So I'm going to put a bang important at the back, or I'm going to use an ID selector or something like that, right? Because I've seen a lot of these like frameworks that the idea is essentially it abstracts away the need for you to know CSS. You just learn a bunch of class names and then there you go. But they do use important quite a lot to get that, to be able to enforce that if you add a class name that says this is tiny text, it'll always be tiny text, no matter who does what. It just will not change. So maybe it's that. Maybe it's just this unwillingness to give up control. And the web kind of forces you to do that. It's like, you might think you do have control, but you really don't, because it's just like you said, like it's this infinite canvas that can be cropped and rotated in any millions of ways. And now you get stuff you put on your face and just makes it look like you're on the moon looking at the web. So we have no control. So it might be a good idea to kind of play in that sandbox, give up a little bit of control.
Yeah, I think that's hard when you're doing business. I mean, is that part of it? Like a lot of us are doing this for a client who is trying to sell a thing, and they want to sell their thing their way, their brand, their right. So there's sort of this complicating factor that maybe doesn't apply to your personal site, where it would be more acceptable to give up control. But then when we've got this business interest pushed on top of it, it's a lot harder to do that. I sort of think, there's an interesting way in which the web isn't designed for corporations.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the struggle comes out of that.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. But I think maybe because of all these changes and these like frameworks, like I don't want to just name names because I'm going to tend to name the same names, and that's unfair because yeah. But terms like progressive enhancement and graceful degradation, you don't really hear people talk about those things anymore. One of the things that I have, for me, like I talk about it, but it used to be that this was just a common thing, like, like responsive design. It's a thing that you do, mobile first, like I spoke with, when I spoke with Zach Leatherman, I mentioned to him the fact that when there was this, I think it was just after, I think it was just after the move of MDN to React, where we spent like a buttload of time doing performance to try and get the performance of MDN better. And at that time, it felt like a lot of people were talking about performance, like Tim Cadillac, like he helped us, he like consulted on the stuff we did. And now it's like every now and again when Google has a conference, you hear about what's the latest like core web vitals, but that's about it, and nobody really has like these in-depth like talks about this is a way to load fonts on the web. Maybe these things are solved problems now. I don't know, but I think it's like terms like a focus on performance, progressive enhancement, graceful degradation. Like these terms I don't come across as often anymore. If I tell a junior about that today, they will not know what I'm talking about. They'll be like, I don't know what that is. Maybe some of it is also like everything is polyfold, right? Like if you want to use a thing and somebody else's browser doesn't support it, just throw a polyfill at it. It's cool. It doesn't matter. So I don't know. But yeah, it's interesting. But that's why web standards are important, right? And you've been doing a lot, especially in the CSS space. And then I learned on LinkedIn that your funding has been cut and you'll be going slower in that space. And that's super sad on a lot of levels. Like one of them is just like, what the actual, but like it's such important work. And I feel it's just like what we're seeing in open source, where like we have all these things popping out now because people are like, oh, people just don't want to work for free forever. They don't, no, what? And they're super surprised by all kinds of hacks and bugs and stuff because people are just tired and they missed somebody sneaking in a little something. But yeah, I would love you to talk about that because I think it's important for us. I think some companies, nonprofits like the Sovereign Tech Fund is a breath of fresh air. And I would highly encourage them to consider sponsoring you. But that aside, just like what happened? What happened if you can dig into it? Like you were doing all this amazing work. The web developer community is surely sure as hell appreciative of it all. I think the web is better because of it. So end users get a better experience. So what led to the funding being stopped?
Yeah, I don't think it was anything personal. I mean, so the W3C is made up of member companies, right? So that's the big three browser makers, but it's also Adobe, and then a long tail of smaller companies, all sorts of companies that are part of the W3C. And member companies can send their representatives to the different working groups. So the CSS working group is mostly made up of Google, Apple, Mozilla folks, some Adobe folks, some Microsoft folks, and then these working groups also have the concept of an invited expert, somebody who's not part of a member company, but has domain expertise of some kind. And that's the role that I have. I'm one of several invited experts on the CSS working group, and it can be an expensive hobby. There's meetings around the world, there's calls every week. And then if we're going to do anything in addition to all the meetings, like actually try to develop a specification, it's a lot of time commitment. And if you don't have a company paying your way, that's hard. So when I was invited to be an expert for the first year, it was just odd bird. We pay ourselves a little bit for open source time. So we have 10% time that we can spend on open source projects. So I was just doing that and moving pretty slowly. But a lot of invited experts will get sponsored. So a company will come along, Bloomberg sponsored grids. Bloomberg wanted grids on the web. And so Bloomberg paid people to make there be grids on the web, which is great. There's invited experts who are sponsored by like the Japanese print industry, newspapers, to improve like international typography on the web. There's all sorts of companies have an interest, and here's an expert that can help them work on the relevant standards. So at one point, Google came along and said, we'd like you to look at a few of these specs. Are they interesting to you? And they funded me for a while, and I was able to do a lot more work. And then over the last year, Google has been cutting all of their funding everywhere. So that fund that had been put together to sponsor open source work, that fund entirely was not funded this year. So that's not just about me. That's, big companies are cutting their budgets. And I happen to be relying on one, which doesn't feel, I never felt stable in that. I didn't assume that Google would eternally want to fund whatever I want to do in the working group. But it's hard to know how to replace that. I can ask developers. Developers are the ones most impacted by the work I'm doing, but also it's weird to ask developers to pay me for these features. I want the companies to pay, not the individuals. It's lovely. A few developers have now chipped in on our open collective to help support this work. But it really does feel like something that companies should be willing to do. I think Google and other companies do get a lot out of these features, and the fact that they were funding it was good. But it's sort of not a direct. There is nobody that is making their living off of container queries, except for me. So it's a hard selling open standards. It's hard to know who you're pitching that to, or who should be funding it, or who's willing to chip in. It's sort of a roundabout thing. But I have other features that I've been in the middle of. I'm an editor on several specifications. I would like to keep doing it, and I don't know how much I'll be able to keep doing it.
Yeah. That's sad. But I hear you. I'm assuming there are other collectives or nonprofits, however they are classified, who are also concerned about this. I'm thinking I don't even want to say, because I'm so scared I'd jinx it, but I'm thinking of like people like Open Web Docs, like I know a significant portion of their stability is thanks to the big companies like Google, Facebook, Meta,
Right.
and
Yeah.
Adobe and those companies. So if they withdraw funding, that is big trouble. But even if they cut funding, it's super challenging. And it's they have gotten funding from the Sovereign Tech Fund, but it's only so much. And they are a very, very small team, but people need to pay stuff. I mean, you have bills, and Medicare is not cheap. So yeah, these are the
Yeah.
realities of life. So
Yeah, I really like the open web docs model. I like there's a little bit more stability when you have all of the companies paying into it,
yeah.
Instead of just one. Um, I, you know, I don't know if there's space to do the similar sort of thing, but for standards, or I don't know if there's. I mean, I keep thinking I also love teaching. Is there a way to say I'm not only working on these features, I'm working on teaching these features, writing about them, documenting them. Is there tie-in? I don't know. I think it's a lot of open questions, and I'm still trying to figure out, is there a way to do this that is not just contributing in my free time, which is limited?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's the creator economy. I'm putting it in quotes for those just listening.
Sure.
The creator economy problem, right? It's like I mentioned about Patreon, and talking about the fact that social media and these things are great for reach, but when you want to talk directly to your audience, it's not there. And I think it's the same thing here. If you have 1,000 super fans, they can probably sustain you doing this kind of work all the time without even having to look to companies and sponsors. But how to build that following, because also relying on people is difficult, right? Because people go through hardships, and I think a lot of people now are going through it. I'm going through one of those right now.
Yeah.
There's it's so sad for me sometimes. LinkedIn is like bad news feed that I sometimes see with old people who like just you see them asking and saying like they're looking for work, and then 6 months later you see them begging like, I will do anything, kind of thing. And I'm like, wow,
Right. Yeah.
things are tough there.
Yep.
And so it's that kind of situation where people are like, I would love to give you like $10 a month, but I just can't. I literally just
Right.
cannot. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I'm doing, the reason you care about it is potentially for your job, and it's for your company, and it maybe feels like they should be the ones paying, not you, which makes sense to me. I think it's hard to know exactly who the direct audience is, or when you're building tools for people who are working for other companies, how do you talk to the right people to get that funded? And I think it's something that other people have been dealing with too. I mean, all the invited experts deal with this. How much time can they put in on their own, or can they find somebody like Bloomberg that will sponsor something they're working on? So I'm not alone in it. And I also know, like, I'm not the only one that lost funding from Google. There's been a lot of layoffs, and that's awful. So yeah, I think it's hard out there.
Yeah, it almost when you mentioned the fact that like Bloomberg was paying for grids because they needed grids on the web, and like some the Japanese folks paying for the typography stuff. It almost sounds like government lobbying, but for good.
yeah, definitely.
It's like, we'll give you some money because we need grids on the web, so let's make it happen.
I also like you referring to it as the creator economy. I feel like referring to my specs as content. I'm developing this standards content.
Yeah, but I mean, I think like what we were talking about, the teaching aspect of that goes into the creator economy side of it, right?
Yes,
so the
definitely.
one leading into the other one, and they kind of feed on one another. So technically they're not separate. Like if people stop making instruments, then musicians will have to either make their own instruments, or they will have to go completely electronic, kind of thing, right? So it's like, if we stop making the standards evolving the web, then we will have to kind of invent it ourselves. Like polyfills, but that will be how you would get new features. You would have to like pull in libraries from all over the place. And the
Right.
thing that people don't realize is if that happens, like right now, it's hard to surf the web on a 3G connection. Good luck on a 4G connection if we have to pull every little feature as a separate framework that, or library that adds this feature. And every single website needs to do it because the browser's not going to give it to you because the standard doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And it's going to be different across the different browsers and the
Right.
different libraries that you use. If you use a library from person A and they use a library from person C, it's not going to work quite the same way. And so good when you job hop, you're going to have fun trying to learn
Right.
how to do grids with this library because it's not standard across browsers.
Right. One of the things that we've been playing with at Oddbird is building polyfills that really polyfill based on the specification. And that's also something where we have a polyfill that was basically ready for anchor positioning, and then the anchor positioning spec changed, and we'd love to get the polyfill up to date because it's still useful when one browser ships before the others, to be able to say, well, we wrote it consistent with the specification, and when the other browsers ship, the polyfill will get itched. How do you fund polyfills? I don't know that either. But we're also working on that and also trying to fund it through our open collective. If people want anchor positioning polyfilled, Chrome is talking about releasing it in May, I think.
I saw Una tweeted about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that the other browsers are working on it, but I don't know how far out there are. Apple will never tell us, and I don't know from Mozilla.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think I think it's Una, not Una. I remember.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It's Una. Yeah.
Yeah.
I stepped into the hole there of mispronouncing a name. What is it like to do a spec? Like, I've tangentially looked at it from the sidelines, but I've never been involved. I've read the HTML spec and that kind of thing, but I've never driven one. Like, what does it look like from the other side?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird and it's collaborative because and maybe this is particularly because I'm still fairly new to it. I mean, I've been doing this for about 4 years, but the working group is made up of a variety of us looking at different parts of the language. There's very few people that have the whole thing in their head, and so it's a very collaborative thing where I'm talking to browser engineers because I don't understand all of the browser internals and all of the limitations of what an implementation can actually do. I'm coming at it from a web authoring perspective. I know how to write things with CSS, and I understand the language pretty well, but I don't understand the browser engine as well. So particularly for me, there was a lot of relying on other people to help figure out, what does the spec need to say to achieve the. In some ways, I'm working like a UX designer, handing it over for somebody else to code. And I have opinions on how this feature needs to work, and what the experience working with it should be, what the shape of the API is, and then I'm talking to Elika Edemad, Fantasy, and Tab Atkins have been doing this for years. They are the editors on at least half of the CSS specifications. So a lot of it is, here I wrote a draft. Now can you help catch all the things that I don't know to be looking for? One of the things I love about them, I mean, they're both very helpful, and will help people sort of step through that process. What exactly does it need to do? What exactly do we need to think about? it's an interesting balance where we're trying to make it, in CSS specifically, there's a high priority on it being readable. You should be able to read the spec and understand what the feature does. But it also has to be specific and technical enough that the browser vendors all build the same thing. And it's very important that no matter how they approach it from their different browser engines, they get the same result. So we have to be very specific. There was a point with container queries where we had a working prototype in Chrome, and we still didn't know if it was going to be possible because there were a few edge cases where different browsers would have gotten different results based on the differences in their engines. And if we couldn't close those gaps and make it be predictably the same everywhere, we wouldn't have a solid spec. So there's that need to make it predictable, make it lay out the steps that make it work the same everywhere. So it's this balance of we have to get to that level of detail without actually telling you how to do it, because you're all writing code in different languages, in different contexts, different engines. So it's a strange sort of extreme detail, but without any specifics. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Very detailed pseudocode almost, that then it has to be human readable. It's an interesting balance. And, I don't get it right in every commit. A lot of it is here's me trying to describe how it should work. And then I need browser engineers to say that this needs to change, this needs to change. And then it's a lot of conversations. And it's also, it's a very political process in the sense of a spec is worthless if nobody's willing to implement it. We talk about spec fiction. What happens when you have a specification that doesn't match reality, which is a problem. And so there's this back and forth of, the spec doesn't end up being exactly what you imagined. It ends up being what everybody was able or willing to implement of what you imagine. And there's always that, which I think is interesting. I don't think that's a problem. I think that's an interesting challenge to get people on board and find the common ground and find where it's going to work for everybody.
Yeah. So it must, I'm just assuming, I can just imagine it being a lot of work. So it must suck if you get buy-in from two of the three and one is just vehemently opposed to it. And it's well, in that case, we got to pull it.
Yeah. Well, and I got lucky with the first three specs I worked on. They were all things that all three browsers were pretty clear we needed. And so I sort of got a smooth onboarding. They were difficult problems to solve, but already a lot of thought had gone into them. I mean, container queries, people have been talking about since 2010 when media queries landed. Immediately, people wanted container queries. So there was a lot of material to draw from. Everybody agreed it was a problem that needed to be solved. And even cascade layers, which wasn't an old conversation, as soon as I proposed that to the group, basically everybody looked at it and said, yeah, we need that. Let's build it. So there was very little pushback on those. Now it's I've helped out on other specs with colors. There's a lot more discussion and different engines pushing back on different parts of it, or nesting. There was some of that. But yeah, I got a smooth onboarding with that. But yes, it can be a challenge. I think getting the three browsers, it's mostly the three browsers that are there in the meetings, getting them all on board. That is the biggest part of the job in a lot of ways.
Yeah. There's something I was thinking about this now and it slipped my mind. But so I wrote this a little post the other day, 21 pieces of unsolicited advice for junior web developers. And one of them was, I think it's tip number 8, was more than learning to code, learn to collaborate. Um, and it sounds to me like I wasn't wrong there, because what you're talking about is like none of this will happen without really, really good, solid collaboration and being able to sit in a room, whether that's a Zoom room or a real room, and just talk through a problem and being able to be,
Hmm.
to adjust a little bit. Not always want just like, I want to be right. It's like that type of thing. You have to be willing to
Yeah.
adjust or your spec will not see the light of day
Yeah.
kind of thing. Yeah, interesting. So
Yeah.
I
I
guess,
mean, I think that's true. I think that's true throughout everything that we do. I mean, I think also that came up recently for me. Somebody was asking, do designers need to learn to code, or do programmers need to learn design? And sort of thought, well, everybody needs to learn to collaborate. I don't care who's doing what part. Um, if we're not talking to each other, if we're not working together to build the thing together, we're gonna fail at it. Designers, the designs have impact on code, and code has impact on designs, and so those two specialties need to be talking. Um, we're not working in isolation. We're always collaborating.
yeah, no, and that wasn't always so. I remember when I was working on the Mozilla.org website, we had that problem. That's a problem we had to talk about, because we had the thing where people would go off and design like some page and they'd throw it over the wall and we have to implement it. And there was a lot of waste there, because oftentimes there wouldn't be common reusable components. So every page would almost be like a bespoke thing. Sometimes that's what you need, but more often than not, it's just because the designer and the developer aren't talking. And so there's no real room for the developer to, in the creation of it. Like, it's really hard at the end of a design to say, oh, but you know what? Could you change that to be like this? Because we actually have something that's very close. It's much easier if you're seeing it like evolving and you're like, oh, you know what, that thing, we actually have a component for that. So if you could tweak it a little bit, then you can kind of think about it in the design. I think accessibility is one of those things, right? Which is much, much harder if you come afterwards and say, ooh, now we need to make it accessible. Instead of saying, let's consider that
Yeah.
as we're writing the
Hmm.
thing, as we're designing the thing, as we're choosing the colors, all this type of stuff.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I love about a team like Oddbird is we get to do that. We get to there is no wall. Nobody is throwing anything over a wall, and it's been fun, even developing processes for the first step when we're working with a new client, working on a new project, is we lay out a table of the objects. What are all the things involved here? And the programmers are looking at that as almost a database model. One-to-one has many, I don't know. The designer is looking at exactly the same content and having opinions on it, and isn't thinking as a database designer. They're thinking as a visual designer. But we've got the same objects we're manipulating. We've got to use the same terms for them. And it's fun to see this, like, backend programmers and designers working together on the same object model. And yeah, putting that together as a collaboration between visual design and database API design. Um, and then we carry that throughout. So before a feature is released, we're often sitting down a front end developer and a designer and pair programming the final stages of the design. You drew me a static picture, but here it is, live, interactive, moving. What are the final adjustments we need to make for this to go into the world?
Yeah. Now for me, that, like, if you have a bunch of people who enjoy working together, I think that is the best part of the whole thing. Like, it's cool to, know how to code, and it's great if you can design beautiful things, but the real joy is in bringing people together to make cool stuff. And you like click launch and it goes live and you're like, we created that.
Yeah,
You added the
exactly.
little animation thingy that made it come to life. You did the little hover on the button, but I
Right.
did the underlying design. And by the way, it's so beautiful to work with it from a JavaScript perspective because we thought about the API well. So it's so obvious for me what the endpoints are to call and what I'm going to get back when I call the endpoint, because we talked about this. I think that to me is like one of the most beautiful things about creating stuff for the web.
Yeah, and I'm sad when I see people dealing with code reviews that are mean. Um, for us, like the ability to review each other's code is such an opportunity, and it's not about correcting something. It's about how can we push this detail, and this is a clever idea. Let's take it farther. What can we do here? Having more eyes on a thing, having more. I think also, at least for me as a programmer, um, you know, I try different things, right? And then some of them stay in the code when they shouldn't have. Like I went a different direction, but I forgot to remove this part. And um, having somebody else just with an outside eye look at that is a huge, huge advantage. Code review is some of the best part of the job if you have a good team to do it with.
100% agree. I have a very good friend who used to work with me at Mozilla. He's at GitHub. I've moved on as well, but we're still friends and talk frequently. And like when I saw him assigned to an issue or a pull request of mine, I was always like, yes, because he did the most thorough like pull request at reviews. At some point, he would say like, I hope I didn't say too much. I'm like, no, this is what I like when you do it, because you bring a whole different perspective to it, and you're like, I can see you
Right.
actually read my code. It's like sometimes if you send somebody an email and they reply to you and they ask a question you answered in the email, you're like, you didn't read my email.
Yeah.
So it's so refreshing when you can see somebody took the time to actually read your code,
Yeah.
and they're giving you like
Yeah.
inline little things like this. Should this be a const? Shouldn't it? Or should
Yeah.
this be a const instead of a let? Like, really small detail that you've missed.
And I like your example there because I find that often what we're doing in code review is asking questions. It's not this should be. It's why did we choose? Why did you choose to go this way? Versus my instinct would have been a different way, but I haven't thought through it the way you have. So let's have that conversation. Because there's not a right way and a wrong way. There's lots of choices and trade-offs, and so
Yeah.
getting to talk through those pushes our work to be better.
Yeah, agree. This is a potentially massive topic, so feel free to like say as much or as little as as you feel like. I spoke the other day with Hida de Vries,
Mm-hmm.
and I brought this up with him, and I thought I'd bring it up with you. It's something that I've been thinking about for a while now, and it's the fact that it's AI, but it's more specific, like really really specific. So there's a bunch, like you have your LLMs, and they generate language. Now, programming is a form of language, so they happen to be really good at that as well. So kind of generative code, and debatable how good they are depending on the language and the scenario. But for me, the bigger concern I have is around accessibility, because it
Mm-hmm.
almost feels to me like it's one of those things where the genie's out of the bottle and you're not going to put him back. So people are going to have these things generate code, and they're probably going to generate more and more code. Now, I, like Hida said, like there's no easy answer, because you'll have to have a model that's trained on good examples of good HTML, and then there's situational stuff, there's nuance, there's so many things. But I was thinking, okay, but let's start at like just the first little Lego piece, because there's some things that's just like an input should have a label and it should be associated, that kind of stuff, right? Very like basic things. But I don't know, is there a way? Is there a way that one can kind of guide these models into seeing that people are going to give it a Figma design and say, generate the code? Is there anything we can do to try and get these models to at least generate decent, accessible code? Or is it just like, you have to fix it after?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on models. It's like a language model is not how I would approach that problem, even technically, in my mind, right? It's doing statistical analysis of what word comes next, and that's not how I'm thinking when I'm writing code. I'm not trying to think what comes next statistically. I'm trying to convey something specific, and an LLM has no concept of that. It has no concept of trying to achieve a task or trying to convey something. That's not even part of the tech. So I am willing to believe that there is some use case where a language model is helpful. I don't understand how it would help me write better code or how I would teach it to write better code, because until it has a concept of solving a problem built into the technology, that's not what I want from a collaborator or a tool. So if I wanted a tool that helped me associate a form label with an input, I would write a tool that knows what an input is and knows what a form label is and knows whether they're associated. Right? And that's not a language model. So what are we doing here? I don't get it. And so I guess I don't really have an answer on how to do it better, because the premise doesn't make sense to me. The idea that a language model would be the tool to use here just fundamentally doesn't make sense to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's a good answer. I mean, I don't think there is an answer here. That's the thing. It's a question without a real answer at this point in time.
Yeah.
It's all speculation and things. And I think that that's a good way of looking at it. It's like, I think sometimes people say, should I be learning React? And I'm like, that is a very a question with very many answers, because my first question is going to be, to what end? Because that's going to be important. If it's like, to make me the most marketable candidate, yeah, you should learn React.
Yeah,
100% you should be. Why don't you know it already? But if it's like, because I'm thinking long term, I would say it doesn't really matter. I would rather focus on the web platform, because that's going to stick around, whereas React might go away tomorrow. So I think that question of mine is one of those. It's like, here's a question, but there's so many ways you could answer this. I don't even know what I'm trying to ask, really.
I think, it's true to some extent that, language models are going to be with us. They're not going away. But I'm hoping that at some point we get through the idea that they are the solution to everything, because they're not. They're just another tool. And autocomplete is really useful. And there's other things that are useful that language models do. In a lot of cases, they do it better when they're small language models, but that's a whole different topic. But the fact that we have a new tool and it's useful sometimes is not the same as saying that it should now replace every other tool that we've ever had in our toolkit, or that is the right solution to every problem we have. Those are different things. And when we start treating one tool like it's the final tool or whatever, I feel like we're just in a hype cycle, and let's get through that and figure out what it's actually useful for.
Yeah. I mean, I can make 100% parallels between that statement and React, for sure. We would definitely,
definitely.
But we've gotten over the hype cycle there, I believe. Like, there's enough choice now, and enough different approaches to solving the same underlying problem, that it's not all React anymore. The reason why I said, yes, if you're thinking about marketable scales, React's a good idea, is just because of the hype cycle. There's so much React code out there that if you want a good chance of being employed, React would be a good thing, a good idea. Definitely. So talking about frameworks and then jumping to the other side, which I said is the more, I don't want to say better, but whatever, the other side of the coin. So at the bottom of your website, it says the site was built using open web standards and indie web principles. So I dig that. That's super cool. I think we've talked a lot about web standards, and I believe that people
Mm-hmm.
will understand why that's important. But what are the indie web principles?
So I saw that you were going to ask this question, and I I went and Googled it. Well, or DuckDuckGo'd it, I
Uh-huh.
suppose. But yeah, it's. I think the basics of it, and I mean, I wrote that line years ago. So what was I thinking? But I mean, in my mind, what it means there in my footer is that I believe in a web for all of us, where we have our own places where we get to present our own identity, what's important to us. I mean, the idea that it seems to me that the core of the indie web is just that you have your own place on the web that you manage. It's not part of somebody else's. Somebody else doesn't own your data. Somebody else isn't controlling the algorithm of it. It's just your space where you say your thing. And so, in that sense, anybody could put this line at the bottom of their website if they have a personal site. That is the indie web. That's all it is. I mean, pulling up, indieweb.org or whatever, and they actually have a long list of principles, which was fun to read through. And it does start with basically that one: own your own data, which I think is a great place to start, and is in some ways where I start. There is like, yeah, this is. I have pulled together my online identity in one place, described the way I want, with me in control of all of that data. And then I can post elsewhere from it. Um, there's a lot of other interesting principles that they list. I love them all, so I still feel confident about indie web principles. Uh, yeah, I think another one that I think was on there was something about the networking. Um, the web's a collaboration of all of us. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the nice things about building your own site is that it can change as you change. So, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
like your identity isn't fixed. Like even though social media platforms would like you to believe that it is, and that they can nail it down and then sell it, like mentioned, that's untrue. People change. Today you
Mm-hmm.
like purple. Next year you think like, what was I thinking? And you can redesign it completely if you feel like it. You can make it just be
Yeah,
HTML, and nobody can tell you not to do that.
exactly.
It's
And I can
your
redesign it as often or as rarely as I want.
exactly.
I can have a blog that I only post on once every 10 years. I can do what I want.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that part of it. I wanted to ask you earlier, but then let's just do it right now. Should people get involved in open web specifications? And if yes, how? How?
Yeah, I mean, both of those are interesting questions. I mean, I think if you want to is is maybe the answer. Um, I think it's great. I don't think it's for everyone, and I don't mean. I just mean, like, if that doesn't interest you, why bother? Or to what end, I should say. To what end do you want to get involved in specifications? It's interesting. I think there was a point where it switched for me, where I had been part of some standards conversations before, um, but very much thinking of it just from an authoring perspective. Just what's the feature I need? What's the syntax that looks nice to me? And that's an important perspective in standards. People should continue to contribute those thoughts. Just at the very basic, I'm an author, this is what I like. Uh, and that is a great way to start being part of the conversations. That voice is needed. A lot of the CSS working group is browser engineers who never write CSS. So having people come into those conversations and say, I write CSS, here's what I think is an excellent place to start. All of those conversations are on GitHub, including when we have meetings that are just the working group. You can't come to the meeting, but you can read the transcripts. All of that is in the issues on GitHub. So yes, get involved with that. If you have thoughts on new features that are coming out, go post your thoughts. People are interested. The sort of next level of that is thinking about it as a cohesive language. I mean, a programming language is a piece of software, right? And we know what it's like to build software, and people use that software, and the user's input is essential, and also they're not necessarily looking at the whole picture of the software, right? And so we need this conversation back and forth. We need some people that are thinking about the software as a thing, and some people that are thinking about what it's like to interact with it with their use cases. And there's the misattributed quote. Henry Ford never said it, but if I had asked them what they needed, they would have said a faster horse. And I always think with that, yeah, that's essential, right? Like we need to know that they want a faster horse, and then we can do something with that. It's goofy to use that sort of quote as dismissive. It's not dismissive. It shouldn't be dismissive. That's an essential perspective. And then also, what we do with it is not always exactly what was asked for, because we're trying to build a piece of software that's cohesive in its own ways. So yeah, the next level of depth after you've contributed as a web author, contributing your use cases, contributing your perspectives, what works for you. The next step is to sort of get into, okay, how does this whole language work as a cohesive piece of software? What are the connections that we can make? How can we develop new features that address the author needs and address user needs, but remaining cohesive to the language, thinking 10 years ahead. I mean, that's one of the big things, is the sort of like, there's what feels good now, and there's the how do we do it in a way that's still going to make sense in 10 years when all of the frameworks have changed, and we're still going to have this feature. How should it work long term, not just for the transition? And that's a really hard one. I think there's a few places in like Cascade Layers where we really had to say, this is going to make it more painful for people now to start using this feature. And that's frustrating. But in 10 years, this is the way that it should still work, even though it was more painful now. But then, yeah, it's still the same sort of thing. You start making that jump, you contribute those ideas. Right? I mean, at least for me, I was researching the Cascade to teach it. I thought, here's a way we might be able to make it better. Jen Simmons encouraged me to post that on GitHub, and that's how I became a working group invited expert. Is I contributed an idea to the Cascade, and they said, "Great, come write the spec."
You're like, oh no, why did I say that?
Yeah, exactly. So then you're in trouble, because then you have to find funding.
Oh man, yeah, as if writing the spec isn't enough stress.
Yeah, but I mean, other people have gotten into it in other ways. You can also go work for one of these member companies and be sent in as a representative, and it still takes those same sorts of contributions. Or you can get involved in standards from the browser engineer side, or even several people who build tooling around web features have become contributors to the languages. Romain Menke from Post CSS, part of the working group, and building tools around CSS and contributing back to CSS. It's excellent.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that leads nicely into what I wanted to talk about, Sass. So
Mm-hmm.
Sass, CSS, and the future. So I don't remember if it was you or somebody else that asked on one of this on Mastodon, or like, what is stopping you from not using Sass? Like, is there anything in
Mm-hmm.
Sass that makes you still use it over just plain CSS? And I think for me at that time it was the mixins and nesting. Nesting was a big one,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's what a lot of people were like. That's just, I don't know. It was just such a lovely way to write CSS. You have to be careful because it could be a massive foot gun, but in general, if you're cognizant of not nesting 10 levels deep, you should be okay. Um, but with that in mind, like, what is the future of Sass? Like, you've been spearheading some massive new features in CSS that is, kind of like changed, made CSS even more powerful than it was. So, where does Sass fit into this picture?
Yeah. Sass is server rendering, is how I would think of it. So, you have a component. There are some things that it has to do live in the browser, and there are some things that it can server render. And that's what Sass is for. Sass is when you have some bit of logic that needs to be done somewhere, but there's no need for it to be dynamic in the browser. And then tools like Sass, Post CSS, whatever, are there for that. They're the server rendering step. And I think I feel both ways about it. Like, if you don't need extra build steps, you don't need extra dependencies, get rid of them. If the feature in CSS is all you need, that's excellent. Just use CSS. And also, I think it is strange to imagine Sass and preprocessors leaving, because servers aren't leaving. And there's still things that we can do on servers just fine. So why not? I think one of the ones that I keep imagining, one of the big reasons I keep using Sass, besides, I mean, I use functions and mixins a fair amount, but one of the big ones that I miss if I try building a plain CSS site is I want to break my files apart. And I love at import, and I just, but how do you get around the fact that multiple imports are going to be multiple server requests? That's not like a problem that I can solve by writing a new spec in CSS. I, partials have to be combined server side if you don't want multiple requests to the server. So that has to be a server side feature. So, okay, I guess I'm using Sass for that still. That's the one I don't know how to fix. Mixins and functions, we can bring those to the browser, no problem. How do we handle partials and putting them back together? Can we do that in the browser without a performance hit? I don't know.
Yeah. That's a tricky one. Yeah. So it's again this thing of, it's just a different way of thinking about Sass. It's not putting them next to each other like Sass, CSS, and saying like, it's like, no. The place where you use them is different, and therefore they serve different purposes. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But then in terms of like JavaScript, there's quite a bit in CSS now that or takes away the need for JavaScript. There's a lot of stuff you
Mm-hmm.
before you use JavaScript for, now you could just use CSS. What are some of the things that you would like to call out that like maybe not a lot of developers know about? And I know this is like a huge topic by itself, but so limited to as few examples as you wish.
Well, I mean, I think part of my problem answering that question would just be that I don't always know what developers are trying to do with JavaScript. I mean, there's very little that I do with JavaScript to my CSS. I think, one of the places where I know that people have used JavaScript in place of things like Sass And they're the reason I don't. I don't like using JavaScript for my CSS. And that's generally like just developer experience, I guess you would call it. It's less about the features that are in CSS, and it's more about sort of how we write it, how we generate it, building in these imperative ideas like mix-ins or variables. One of the reasons I like something like Sass over something like JavaScript for that is because Sass knows what a length is, knows what a color is, knows what an angle is. These are design concepts that don't exist in general purpose programming languages because they are design specific types. And I find it very funny that people are writing TypeScript where they've got they care so much about their types. And then they jump into CSS and everything is suddenly a string. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense to me. Everything is not a string. Some things are colors. Some things are lengths. And we need to know the difference between them. So in some ways, Sass is my typing language for CSS. It understands what a color is and how to manipulate a color. So I prefer that to JavaScript, which just sees two strings and doesn't know how to treat them as colors without a lot of extra libraries to do that. I mean, I think also selection is a thing that a lot of people do with, attaching things directly in JavaScript rather than using selectors. I mean, it's interesting to me. At Oddbird, we've generally gone the other way, where we've used single file components. I can see that there are sometimes advantages to co-locating things, but it tends to make our code base much bigger. You're not building systems, design systems. I don't know how to say it. Abstract it out, right? We want to build patterns that are going to apply across new components. And if we start putting all of our styles inside of components, then every new component needs new styles. And I get how that feels safer in that we can see the code that goes with the component directly. But we lose all these advantages of what CSS can do across an entire code base. And then if we end up with some of our code in components and some of our code global, it starts to get very complicated. We end up often just preferring global styles because we can have a small CSS file that applies to 15 different components. We don't need a new file for every component. That's the one that stands out to me. I don't know if it's what everybody would go to.
Yeah, no, but I think maybe this talks a little bit to the fact that you said like in just pure CSS or vanilla, whatever, the whole separating your files thing being a problem. Because I've heard a lot of people say the reason they like that is because they can delete one thing and it deletes everything that goes with it. So,
Right.
from a maintenance perspective, it's like easier to know that I delete this component, and as I do, I delete any HTML and CSS that is associated with it instead of having to hunt for it somewhere else. If we had a better way of separating out files and just plain CSS, maybe that'd be less of an interesting angle to say.
I think what I'm also trying to get at is how we build, or how these different approaches encourage different ways of writing CSS, right? So I have to worry less about deleting the component and then finding the CSS to delete if I'm not writing my CSS as much for specific components. And when we start to break things, everything is a component file. we start to write more component CSS. And I think that's not the strength of CSS. And that's the step that we need to avoid. Because I agree, we want to be able to delete things safely, but I think the component thinking gets us stuck in certain systems. I think in components quite a bit, but design systems are bigger than components. And I think we sometimes write more CSS than we need to, and then are more worried about deleting it because we've written so much more, because everything is in a component file and everything is scoped. And that means we don't get the advantages of writing a little bit of CSS that applies everywhere.
Yeah, I've definitely run into that, where it's like, oh man, I have to kind of duplicate this because it's not shared. It's in this other component. So, and then you're like, yeah, okay, it's just 4 lines. But then there's the next component. You're like, oh, I have to do it here as well. And then I'm like, I should just really pull this. This should be a global thing. But then it's like, so
Yeah.
would you almost say that one should kind of work the other way around, where you're like, let's do the global bits and then see what we have, and then only address the little things that's really unique about this component, and then collocate that?
Yeah, that's the approach we keep coming back to.
Yeah.
When we do use a tool that has single file components, we try to start global, and you only add things into the single file components if they really are just for that. And as much as possible, you try to define a system that new components don't need new styles, or need very minimal new styles.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's like what you put in the component is the grid template for that component. But sometimes even that, you have, Andy Bell's cube, he talks about compositions, which is basically like, here's some standard grid and flex ways that things lay out, right? Ways of composing different objects into a whole. I think that sort of thinking is useful. How is this reusable across different things? Going back and looking at OOCSS, and a lot of people now say that they don't use OOCSS, but then everything else is just a clone of OOCSS. No, I use this other thing that happens to be exactly the same. But I like, it was one of the things that Nicole was talking about right from 2009. Is she very clearly says objects in CSS are not the same as components, because then we would need a new object for every component that we add. And the whole goal is that when we add a new component, we have existing objects that we can reuse. And we call them patterns at Oddbird. Usually it's like, what's, a card pattern is different from a, I don't know, person card component or whatever it is. The pattern is broader than the specific component.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What is on the horizon for CSS that you know about, or that you're excited about?
Yeah, I'm excited for wide gamut colors. There's so much that's just like in discussion stages. I'm in theory working on mixins and functions. I think those are going to be really useful. I think they open up some other opportunities that are interesting. I've also been working on responsive typography, trying to get at the idea that we need to be able to have things not just change at breakpoints, but change smoothly between them. And there's ways that we can do that in a very linear way, one property at a time, with clamp or calc or whatever. But how do we do that in a smoother way and have fewer points where things are changing completely, and more just like, here's my algorithm for getting bigger and getting smaller. I think there's a lot that we can do there. I think there's ways that grid can help us more in that too. There's a lot of places where like auto grids do a great job of, like, we don't need a media query to get a new column when there's enough space. But we don't have a way of looking at that and saying, when there's more space, this item should span more columns. I don't know. I'm getting into the weeds there, but I think there's a lot of these places where we can just make nice little improvements to how does CSS help you do responsive design in a way that is more about saying what you want declaratively, and less about going through imperatively and specifying at each breakpoint, how are we going to do something different? Yeah, the more and more CSS becomes declarative in ways, I think that's interesting. I think relative colors are interesting. Being able to say, take this color and make it transparent. That's going to be a huge thing for me. That's something that I still need Sass for. And that doesn't work for me because I'm defining my colors as custom properties. So Sass can't do it. I need that to happen in the browser. So getting that relative color syntax, color mixing is already there. Those are huge.
Wow, that is a bunch of really, really nice things, and it's one of those where it's like it's fine tuning a lot of things that already exist there, but that is definitely missing. Like when you hit those scenarios, like, oh man, I wish I could be a little bit more declarative about this.
Right.
I've been there quite a few times. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, margin trim. That's one that there's a lot of text ones that I haven't been very involved in those specs, but I'm really excited about some of the things coming. I mean, just being able to say this box cuts off margins at the edge. Things that are like I put a paragraph inside of there. I don't have to be like, okay, if the paragraph is the last child, then take off the bottom margin. Right? I don't want to do that. I just want to select the box and say trim margins at the edge of this box. And I want it to just work. And people are working on that. I love when people are working on that.
that is a great one. Yeah, that is amazing. Something really just I laughed when I saw this. Like, you have a domain business-business.business. And when you go there, it's like all these dollars, all the S's is dollars and stuff. What's the story there?
So here in Denver, I mostly hang out with theater people and musicians. That's the community that I'm mostly part of. And I have this friend who is obsessed with the idea of being a businessman. He's an actor. He runs a theater company. But he thinks, when you ask him to describe what is a businessman, you notice two things. They only exist in the 80s. Like, there's always an 80s office aesthetic. And they have the power of a king. A businessman is a king in an 80s office building. Anyway, I was like, I should get him an email address where he can have a business address and be a businessman. So I went looking for domains for him. And I found that there was a business top level domain, so .business, and then I just looked around until I found an available, and business-business was available at .business. So I got it mostly just to give him man at business.business. And then I was like, well, I need a website there. It should be I have a personal site. I should have a business site. And then, since business is something in the 80s, I went and looked at, 90s web design and tried to capture some of the aesthetic and put dollar signs on everything. Just trying to make a business site. Mm-hmm. So there it is.
Nailed
Thanks.
It.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite. One of my favorite sites.
It's brilliant.
Impersonal.
Given some really great advice for business people, how about some advice for junior web developers?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if you're, I mean, I don't know how to give the advice if you're looking for a corporate job. I've never had one. Um, I, I, I never learned React, and I never went and applied for a React job. So if that's what you're looking for, there's other people to talk to. What I have done is make my own path, and I imagine that that's a little different now than it was when I started. There was not web development wasn't part of tech as an industry. We were just web developers, um, sort of our own weird thing that nobody knew quite what it was yet. And so it was a very different time to get started in that. There wasn't front end and back end and all these distinctions. There weren't frameworks. We were all just web developers building websites. But you can make an entire successful career learning CSS, getting interested in how it's weird, writing about it, getting involved in different weird places, starting your own company. I mean, I think like if you're interested in building websites for different people, start an agency. This is, people talk about starting unions. I think that's excellent. Everybody should start a union, join a union, or start a collective. You can actually just start your own collective and make your own rules. And there's people think of it freelancing or running your own agency is basically freelancing with a team, which I think is what we're doing. And there's an instability there in that you have to go find your own clients. There's also a stability in that you find multiple clients, and no one gets to lay you off. No one gets to tell you which clients to work for. You decide. Sometimes you have to take clients because you need the money, but you are in control of that day to day. As somebody with ADHD, I think it's great for somebody with ADHD. It's also great to have a team, people with different skills. You're allowed to make up your own path through this. It's a job. It's still a job, whether you're doing it as an agency or going to one of the big tech companies. But depends what you like. And there's not just one path. That's my advice. You can make your own path happen. It just takes work. But it takes work the other way too. So you're allowed to try something different.
Love that. And that's a good place to wrap it up. Thanks so much, Miriam, for taking like a lot of your time out of your day on a Saturday to speak with me. I really appreciate it. In closing,
I appreciate it too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it was
really
a pleasure.
Lovely.
Yeah, it was such a great conversation. I loved it. I can just keep going, but yeah, time. And I guess it's late, and I think my daughter is struggling to keep the dogs behind the door. So, in closing, how can people find and support you?
Yeah, oddbird.net is, Oddbird is the team that I work with, and that's where most of the web stuff is. Miriam.codes is my personal business.business is my impersonal. And then, Oddbird is now trying to find ways to help fund our open source work. That includes my contributions to the working group and also trying to do polyfills. And we've got a lot of other open source projects. So if you do have a company that's using any of these tools or would be interested in them and interested in supporting, you can find our open collective, Oddbird Open Source, and it's linked from our website. And whether or not you do, we're going to keep contributing and keep writing and keep teaching. I'm going to be doing some more CSS workshops coming up. I don't think there's any that are public right now to sign up for, but there will be more coming. I love teaching CSS and talking to people about CSS, and the team loves building websites and design systems and applications. So, reach out to us if you need any of that. I think we have a great team, and we work really closely with internal teams at companies. So, you've got 2 developers and you need to build something on a tighter deadline than 2 developers can deliver. We can come in and work with you and help you deliver something at a higher pace or a higher standard. Or we love doing that work, collaborating with people. We like collaborating with each other, but we really like going out and collaborating with other developers. So yeah, call us up if we can be helpful.
Great stuff. Thanks again, Miriam. Thanks for everything you do for the web. I, for one, appreciate it deeply, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening to the Mechanical Ink podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your friends. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Have something to add? Continue the conversation on GitHub and join the community on Slack. Until the next one, keep all the things open.